Alright, so I'm going to talk to you about the effects on women soccer players on natural grass and artificial turf surfaces. So basically a little bit history of the actual turf is it was created and installed in the Houston Astrodome. And when it was first created, the players were having trouble catching the balls from the glare of the sun on the grass. And so the owners originally decided to paint the roof. Well, as a result of painting the roof, the grass wasn't receiving enough sunlight and so it was dying. So they decided to install the first ever artificial turf. So with turf, there's three generations of turf. The second generation came across in the 1970s, um, and it had some tough spaces in between, widely apart, mimicking similar to natural grass. And the second generation of turf provided a flatter playing surface, and which resulted into better ball control. So they found in the sport of soccer it wasn't comparable to natural grass, and it would cause nasty abrasions on the legs. And so after the second generation of turf, they then came to the third generation of turf, which this generation has longer fibers and bristles which look more like natural grass, and they're made with polyethylene, which is a softer surface on the skin, kind of minimizing the abrasions on the legs. And you still get them, you still get what's called turf burn, but so with the combination of fiber and infill, the results of that were a more comfortable playing surface for a number amount of soccer players, including football players as well. So when looking at the natural grass, most players really like the unique feel and the old school traditional vibe that it brings to the history of the sport. Unfortunately, it's unpredictable playing surface with the weather. It's uneven ground. You don't get the burns and turf burns and stuff like that, but it's really, really hard for the water to drain. And so, in turn, it's just a lot of more maintenance and upkeep, and you're spending more money on that than the overall price of the artificial turf itself. So, with that said, I'm going to kind of go into the study that I produced. So, the purpose of this study is to identify the effects of women soccer players playing on regular grass surface and artificial turf surface, and overall to measure the damage and effects the surfaces each have on the body. So, the problem I identified was will the effects of the two playing surfaces being natural grass as well as artificial turf affect the times of 5 tests that I provided to each 10 of my athletes? So, looking into that, there's variables. So, the independent variable is that there are 10 players being measured, all college Division I soccer players, and the 10 players were split into two groups, an offensive group and a defensive group. Now, in that defensive group was also a goalkeeper, so a goalie otherwise known. And in those dependent variables, we're looking at the artificial turf and the natural grass. So each playing surfaces was comprised of 5 tests being measured on speed, agility, accuracy, and overall composure. So the tests that I designed for the 10 Division I soccer players, like I said, were 5 tests represented from a defensive and an offensive group, as well as this 11-question survey was conducted to each player prior, as well as a consent form, and the results then were recorded. So looking at the test, there was a 25-yard shuttle test at 5 reps. So a player would start on the end line, sprint 5 yards, come back, sprint 10 yards, come back. You see where it's going. 20-yard sprint test. They had to sprint all the way down, make it in that time, and recover running back. After that, there was 5 shots at 20 yards out, and then a cone dribble, 2-rep time, and a 5-10-5 sprint, similar to football tryouts, just to kind of get the times emphasized on those. So as seen in the PowerPoint, I recorded the results, and in the PowerPoint, the defensive players were measured in blue, the offensive in red, and then each results were recorded for each 5 tests on both given surfaces of the field. So when looking at the surfaces, you're probably wondering what cleats you use, what type of shoes you use, the effects on those cleats on the surface. So typically with artificial turf surfaces, they have turf shoes. So they're made with a plastic bottom. Sometimes they have little studs that are plastic, and sometimes they're more of a flat with divots in the bottom of them. As well as the great thing about artificial turf is you can use cleats. So you have pretty much 3 to 4 options of the type of shoe overall that you can use on artificial turf. Now when looking at natural grass, you can only use cleated studs on that surface. And so with that, it helps the player be able to dig into the ground. Obviously digging in the turf, like the turf isn't going to give, and what I mean by that is the dirt's not going to come up. It's not going to move. It's going to stay exactly where it was with the rubber pellets into the ground, and the grass isn't going to dig up out of the ground. So that's one of the nice things at looking at it. And so in my PowerPoint, I had a video. I had an opportunity to talk with Texas Christian University's head athletic trainer, and he's retired now and works still in sports medicine field. And he kind of gave me some insight about both playing surfaces. And a great outlook that he kind of gave was the surfaces always change, but most of all, it just depends on the position of the player. If the player's had any previous injuries prior to the sport, or if they've received any injuries, and what surface did they receive those injuries on, as well as the climate. And that was a great perspective kind of for me to realize, is even though being a former athlete of the sport was, well, looking at turf in Texas, for example, where I came from, a lot of the times in the summer, it gets really, really hot. Well, typically on turf, in that hot climate, it gets 10 degrees warmer than the actual temperature. Also, with the heat, you have to look at how it's going to dry the field out of natural grass. And if you're in, say, Seattle, it rains a lot there. So most of the time they have more artificial turf than natural grass just due to the weather conditions. So you kind of have to take in not only money, or the amount of money you want to put into managing regular grass, for example, but also where are you living? What conditions? If you look at the East Coast, well, they deal with a lot of snow. So would it make sense to build a dome necessarily for artificial turf and for them to practice, not only to avoid the cold weather, but to avoid the cost of ruining the field that they put the money into? So there's a lot of things to consider. When you're looking at specific positions, say you take a goalkeeper, there's a lot of cutting, a lot of diving. They found some studies that have recognized that the turf beads, those rubber beads in the ground, are causing some form of cancer in goalkeepers. And is that just as a result that they're dealing with the turf more? Or, so that's another interesting thing I would say that could be cool to study. So moving on to the survey that I mentioned earlier, the kind of questions I typically ask were, what's your age? How tall are you? How many years have you been playing this sport? What's the highest level of competition? So given that all these players that I observed were Division I players. List any previous injuries if these injuries were operable, ACL tears, meniscus tears, or were they just strains and sprains that you could rehab? What position did you play? Typically, what brand of cleats did you use, or when you play, what do you wear? Do you believe playing in unpredictable weather such as rain or ice is enjoyable or harder to the style of the game that you play? If you've torn your ACL, how many times have you, and which knee did you tear it on, and what playing surface did you tear it? Do you wear different cleats depending on the surface? So do you switch, if you play on a turf field, do you switch your cleats to the studded cleats, the flat surface cleats, or do you still wear your cleats on the regular surface? And which ultimately do you prefer to play on is another thing that I asked, which I found very interesting. I interviewed a girl that was part of the trial who has torn both of her ACLs back-to-back years, but on both natural grass surfaces, and had never had any knee problems prior to college. Unfortunately, I think some of it is a little bit of bad luck, but it's part of the game. So going into the results, like through evaluating the players and the breakdown, the defense, the scores averaged and calculated. So on testing and the evaluation on the artificial turf side, the scores recorded that the 25-yard shuttle, the 120-yard sprint, and the 5-10-5, as well as the 5 shots, the player averaged 1 shot higher on the natural grass. So, but those test mentions before, so the 25-yard shuttle, the 120, and the 5-10-5 recorded faster on the turf. And then the 2-rep dribble, they were very close, but ultimately the artificial turf scores scored a little bit higher than the natural grass. And then the breakdown seemed that the players are more consistent shooting on the natural grass and dribbling on the natural grass over than the turf. I think, like I said, mentioned before, that's a breakdown of the player, the position, what they're more comfortable with. If they came from, say, like in high school, I played only on turf. Most schools at that point in time, turf was still kind of a new beginning. So a lot of people never had played on turf before. Another thing I looked at was the strength and speed of the agility. The scores were higher, again, on the artificial turf due to the consistency of the surface and the cleats being able to dig into the ground and stay consistent with that. So overall, the study was very interesting. I enjoyed it. Again, being on both sides as a player as well as observing. I am, unfortunately, part of the percentage that did tear their ACL, and it was on natural grass, not artificial turf. For me, it was just a fluke accident. I came out on a corner kick, caught the ball, came down, and a girl collided into me. And like I said, I think part of it is just being unlucky. So through the evaluation of players in comparison of the artificial turf and the natural grass, the overall assessment is simply of the player. If they've had any previous injuries, as I mentioned before, but the findings were overall inconclusive in stating which surface is better for the athlete. So each surface obviously brings unique qualities, having both pros and cons connected, but the sports of soccer just has continued to grow and will continue to grow, and through youth, college, and pro levels, using any surface as mentioned before. So I think that's a great thing to keep in mind, and overall I think there'll be continued research in this topic.